Hello everyone, let's start question 2. It says, a representative of the Department of Tourism gave an overview of the spending by all tourists, domestic and international, in 2013. The total amount spent by all tourists in 2013 showed an annual growth of 9.7% from the previous year. Okay, then it says the impact of tourism on the South African economy is represented graphically in Annex J. Now, as soon as you see anything to do with annexures, go find it, right? You'll have an annexure booklet. You'll see here, there's my annexure. I have it separately with me, and this is what we're going to be working on or working with. Okay, and it says use the information above and Annex A to answer the questions that follow. So it says 2.1.1, calculate the total amount spent by all tourists in 2012. Okay, now this is interesting because students look at annexures and they're like, oh, I don't know what's going on, right? So let's just read through it, see what we can decipher. So it says a graphical representation of tourist spending in South Africa in 2013. So this is all from 2013, right? This is the number of different tourists in different years, right? Not a problem. Average spending per international tourist, right? And this is tourist spending per 100 Rand for different items. So lots of information here, but we're not going to use all of it in every single question. We're just going to break it down and see what we need. So it says here, calculate the total amount spent by all tourists in 2012. Now, we have the total amount spent by tourists in 2013. Now, you could be saying, Margie, that's not very helpful. It is helpful because what do we know? We know that the amount spent in 2013 is 9.7% larger than the amount spent in the previous year, which would be 2012. So actually it is helpful. So what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, first I'm going to label my questions. That's always a good place to start. Question 2 and then 2.1.1, and we're going to do A. So in 2013, what was the amount that was spent, right? It was in totality, right? It was this 218.9 billion. So we're going to write that 218.9 billion. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we need to reduce this to get to our 2012, right? So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say 218.9, and I'm going to divide it by 1.097. Now you could be saying, why on earth are you doing that? Well, remember, this 9.7% that we're talking about is similar to that. It's basically saying, we had this amount in 2012, we added on 9.7% and it gave me this amount. Okay, so similar to, this is almost like the including that, right? Remember when we try to take that out of a number, we always divide, right? Now, where did I get this 1.097? Well, it's effectively this. Okay, that's what I'm dividing it by. So if you would prefer to write that into your calculator, completely fine. I just always put mine into decimals. How do I get from there to there? Well, I just divide by 100, and that's how I get from there to there. Right, so that's what I have there. Let me find my calculator. Make sure you always have your calculator on hand. And we're just going to pop this into our calculator. So we're going to have 218.9 divided by 1.097. Put that in. And the amount is 199.54 billion. Okay, now you could write this out fully, right? Like you could be saying, Molly, why did you write it like that? Why didn't you write this out fully with all of its decimals, right? Because then you would have 218, and then billion would be 900000000. Because remember, billion has 9 zeros. Now you could do that, and you could do the same thing over here, and you could times this by a billion in order to get away from writing it the way that I have written it over here. Let's just see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You must know this, right? 1,000 has 3 zeros, a million has 6 zeros, a billion has 9 zeros, and a trillion has 12 zeros. So that you could write your answer there as well. Students get a little bit angsty when they see things like this, but you can write it like this. They didn't tell you to write it out fully, so you can write it like this. Generally speaking, you would round it off to 2 decimal places, right? And that's kind of your answer there. Right. So let's go on to the next question. That first question wasn't difficult, but it did require you to kind of think through the mechanics of what's being presented and using the information. Okay. Then it says, this question for me, I had to read a number of times. So it says, explain whether it is more appropriate to round off the Rand value of the total amount spent in billions to 1 decimal place, rather than rounding off the Rand value of the total amount spent in billions to the nearest whole number. Now, let me show you what they actually mean, right? So I'm just putting a little example here. If I said to you, 7.6 billion. Okay, right? They're saying, is it better to write it like that, or should I round it off and just write it as 8 billion? They're saying basically this versus this. That's what they're saying. Which one's better? Now, you should be able to see that these are actually vastly different things, right? How do I get from 7.6 billion to 8 billion? Well, you actually have to add 400 million, right? And that's actually a lot, right? So it's basically saying, should you keep the decimal or should you write it as a whole number? And it's saying, okay, well, actually, I need to write it as a decimal because that's more accurate, right? This here is not correct information. It's vastly different to the underlying, right? So then you say, therefore, you don't have to put this example in, so you don't have to put it therefore. I would just say, more appropriate. Oh, maybe you can write better than I do. More appropriate to round to 1 decimal place. Okay, and it also says to explain. So you have to give your answer, and you'll get a mark for that. But then you have to say why, right? And you have to say because, right? Because you are adding, because rounding. You can just say rounding to whole number, rounding to the nearest whole number, loses accuracy, right? You can say loses accuracy. And I think that, yeah, that's fine. You can say that. The memo does have different wording, but remember there's many ways you can reason this. So that's what I would say for that. Okay, that's not an easy question, I don't think, but one of those ones we have to think it through, and I hope that example helped you. Okay, now we're getting to our slightly meatier questions. So it says the average amount spent by the international tourists in 2013 was exactly this. Verify showing all calculations whether this amount is correct. Okay, so remember where it says verify, you have to say, is it correct or is it not correct? You have to actually state that. Okay, so let's look here. Okay, so over here, that's basically what they're asking us to verify. Okay, how are we going to verify it? Well, how do you get this average spending per international tourist? Well, you take the total amount spent by international tourists and you divide it by the number of international tourists, right? And that will hopefully get you back to this. Okay, that should make sense. It's basically saying total amount spent by them, divide by the number that they are, and then we get the amount that each spends. Okay, it's like basic statistics. So let's go and do that. Okay, so we know that international tourists, right, they spend 43% of this total amount here. Okay, that's quite important. So it's not the whole amount, it's 43% of that amount. Okay, so 218.9 billion. Okay, so that's that. So let's go and type that into our calculator. So 43% times 218.9, put that in, and the answer is 94.127 billion. I wouldn't round off here because remember, this is not a final answer. We only really round off at the end, right, at a final answer. So we have that. Okay, let's now then go and see how much each of them spend. So now you need to say 94.127, and you need to then divide that by the number, right, of tourists, right, of international tourists, and these are international tourists in 2013. So now this is in billion, and I need to divide it by 14.3. That's in billion, and that is now in million. Okay, so now it's like a little bit tricky. I need to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Okay, so now I can't work in billions and millions. I have to convert them, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert them all into millions. So I'm going to take this here. Okay, how do I convert this into millions? What's the difference between a million and a billion? 1,000, right? These are things you have to know, guys. So to get this to million, we take this, I'm just going to do it over here, and we times that by 1,000 to get it into million, right? And if you put that in your calculator, it will then be this, okay? And that'll be your answer, okay? Well, that'll be what will be used. So then we're going to say 94127, and we're going to divide it by 14.3, okay? So put that into your calculator, we times by 1,000 because, and again, just to reiterate what we're doing, you can't work in billions and millions, guys. You have to work, it's like units, right? Remember when we do units, you can't work in centimeters and meters. Same thing here with this. We have to work in millions. That's why I converted it, okay? So then here, I'm going to divide this by 14.3, and my answer is 6582.31 Rand. Why is it 31? Remember, we round off to 2 decimal places with currency. The third decimal is 7, it's above 5, so we round up, okay? Now, are we done? No, we're not. We haven't answered the question fully. It says, the average amount spent by international tourists in 2013 was exactly this amount. Well, is our answer exactly? No. So we say, therefore, not correct. Okay, and you have to put that conclusion, right? So many students forget to do that because they're like, oh, I did the calculation, fabulous, let me move on. Don't forget about putting the conclusion. There's a mark allocated there. Okay, sure. This question's actually not too easy. Let's continue. It says, identify the items on which international tourists spent the least money. Now, let's look over here. Okay, so tourist spending per 1,000. So we're looking at international, right? Generally in your paper, this will come in color. I just don't have a color printer. So this is international. So we're looking at basically all this side, okay? Because that is your international, domestic's the other side. So what is the lowest? Well, we see it's road transport and it is air transport because the others are all bigger than 12 Rand. Okay, so it is air and road transport. Okay, so we're going to write that out there. I'm going to say air and road transport. Okay, so it's just a little bit of interpretation there, making sure that you understand what is being asked, okay, or what's being displayed. Let's move on to the next question. 2.1.4, give one suitable example of a tourism-related item. Now, over here, right, it talks about tourism-related item, right? There's lots of things you can say there. It says give one example. I'm just going to say souvenirs, right? So often when tourists come to South Africa or to any sort of place where they're visiting a foreign country, they often buy souvenirs to help them remember or to help them remember the experience or to give to friends, etc., right? And that's what souvenirs are. You could also say like museum interest, tourist attractions, etc. But that's just what, just ask for one. You don't have to have more than one. Right. Let's move on to 2.5. So I'm going to just flip that over there. 2.1.5. Right. So 2.1.5, again, quite a meaty question. So let's unpack it. So it says the tourism industry's direct contribution to the gross domestic product, that's also known as the GDP, right? Oh, it says over there, was 103.6 billion in 2013. The tourism industry's annual contribution to GDP remained constant at an annual compound interest rate of 2.9% for the next 3 years. So that's 2014, 2015, and 2016. So each of those years, right, is 2.9% growth. It says determine the total value rounded off to the nearest million. So we must make sure that we adhere to that the tourism industry contributed to the GDP in 2016. Okay, so this is one of those compound interest questions, right? Now, sometimes they'll give you a formula, and this is the formula that you can use for compound interest, right? But sometimes they don't give that to you, and you could be saying, okay, what's going on there? Well, I'm going to do it 2 ways for you. So originally, we're going to start with that. P is basically what you start with, what's being invested, that amount. Then what's the interest rate over here? It's 2.9%, so that's a little I. Right, the annual interest rate. And then it said for 3 years, the N is basically how many years, and you can just plug that into your calculator. Let me just show that to 1 plus 2.9%. Just make sure you typing this in all correctly. It's very easy to type these things in incorrectly. So then you can say 112.877109.5 billion. Now you could be saying, Margie, why are you doing that? Well, what did they ask for, guys? Very important. It says round it off to the nearest million. Okay, so now the nearest million, we need to make sure that we're doing that correctly. So this is billion, where that little decimal is. Nearest billion, remember, a nearest million is basically the next 3 decimals, right? So we need to round it off there. So So this is 112.877 billion. So it didn't say you had to write it in billion. It said that you had to round it off to the nearest million. So it wanted to test whether you understand in these decimals over here, what is it that's representing a million? What is it representing 1,000, right? So very, very important. This is the millions, because we know that if we were to convert this to million, we would move that decimal 3 places because of the 1,000 millions being in a billion, and that's what it would be there. So you need to round it off. So a big learning here from this question is you need to understand your thousands, millions, billions, and trillions. Okay, that's a key learning here. Now, if you didn't know this method, let's use another method. Okay, you can do each of the years. So year 1, we're going to times by 2.9%. Okay, and we're going to type that in here, 103.6 times 2.9%. So this is basically 2014. Okay, so that is how much interest you got in that year. But now you need to add on to that how much you had at the beginning, right? Which was that. That's what you had at the beginning of 2013. So add that on. So now we're looking at 2015. Okay, so at the beginning of 2015, this is what we have. We need to times that by 2.9% because that's the percentage it increases by every single year, right? And that's going to be 3.0915276. Not a problem, but now we need to add on what was at the beginning of that year. You could be thinking, oh, this is quite tedious. But if you don't know that formula, then this is the way you have to do it, right? You do each of the years separately. So this is interest, right? And remember, with each of them, you take this, you add that together, and that's how you get that. So now I need to add this and this together. So I'm going to say plus 106.6044. And we're going to say 109.69. And you see how I'm not rounding off anything here. Okay, very important not to round off anything. We only round off at the end. Times it by 2.9%. Put it in here, 3.1811819. Okay, we're not done, right? We need to now add that back onto this, and that'll be our final amount, right? Because that'll be basically the end of 2016. So I take this interest, because these are all interest. Remember, follow me as I'm working. 109.6959276. And my final amount, which is exactly the same as what I did earlier, is 112.877. You see I have the same decimals, but I already talked about this rounding discussion. So that is my answer, end of 2016, and that is my answer there. Okay, not actually a very easy question, but if you look at the mark allocation, it is also for 6 marks. So you would expect that it would be a little bit high, sort of like higher order thinking. Okay, that's us done with this part of question 2. We'll move on to the next part in the next video. Cheers.